Did anyone have that story in their children's Bible as a child? Yeah, yeah. I can still remember the children's Bible that we had at home and reading it, and I can even see the picture, and Abraham standing over Isaac, and the ram is behind him, and he hasn't seen it yet, and the knife is raised, and since I've grown up, I've often thought it's a very, of all the biblical stories, it's a strange one to include. But we're going to look at the story a little bit now. One thing that strikes me, and even again when Susan was reading it, is the silence in the story. So God speaks to Abraham, asks him to do this momentous thing, and he just gets everything and sets off for a 3-day trek. And there is no dialogue. He doesn't talk to Sarah. I think we all know why. He doesn't talk to God even. And this is the Abraham that when God called in for tea on his way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, if you find 50 righteous, save the city. If you find, and down and down and down till I think 5 or 10 righteous people, will you save the cities? And God agreed. But in the face of kill who he calls his only son, which we know from the previous chapter, there was Ishmael as well. He just said, there's no conversation. There's no argument. There's no trying to find a caveat or what if, there's nothing. There's just silence. And all the way through the 3 days, there's silence. And, we don't know what age Isaac is, but you can imagine him skipping about, finding wonder in all the things he's seeing on this trek with his dad, and Abraham there carrying this burden that in 3 days, when we find this mountain, this is what I've been asked to do by God. It's not an uncommon story. Agamemnon, who was the Greek king in the battle against Troy, he tried to lead his naval force against Troy, and there was no winds. That was a punishment from the goddess Artemis. And he appeased the god by sacrificing his own daughter. Then the winds picked up, he sailed to Troy, and the rest is history, literature, poetry, whatever you want to say. Jephthah was a leader in Israel, and he vowed to God that if he won a battle, that he would sacrifice the first creature that came from his home to greet him. And when he got home, victorious in battle, his daughter, his only child, ran out to meet him. And he was beside himself, but she said, "You've made a promise to God, you have to fulfill it. And just give me 2 months to go and live my life and I'll come back." And she did, and he killed her. And Lucius Brutus was one of the founders of the Roman Republic, and his sons were involved in a conspiracy to restore the monarchy. And he passed judgment over them and condemned them to death, along with all their co-conspirators. So it's not uncommon story through the ages. So why this sacrifice? What was God trying to achieve? Any thoughts? What if God was teaching the most powerful object lesson of all? What if God knew the heart of people and knew that telling them something would never be good enough, and that the only way was through this object lesson? So the object lesson being that God never wanted Abraham to kill Isaac, but that child sacrifice was very popular and very common throughout lots of the different faiths in the region. And over the years, we see that the Israelites often went after other gods and forgot the God who had led them out of captivity, who had done all these things. And what if God, knowing that, thought, I will take Abraham, the patriarch of this whole population that will come, and I will start this story that's going to be told about your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, and the 3-day trek to Mount Moriah. And the idea is that God never wanted a sacrifice. God never wanted child sacrifice to be a thing. But by just saying that, probably wouldn't have been strong enough. But having that lore, that story that was handed down generation after, you can imagine the children are complaining that they have to go and mind sheep. Well, let me tell you about my childhood. Let me tell you about your grandfather Isaac. You think you have it bad? So what if that was the whole point of the story? What if that was the whole lesson, that God didn't want sacrifice? What do you think?
It's a different slant. It look at it differently.
It's a brutal object lesson, definitely. But I wonder if that's what God was trying to achieve, to demonstrate so wholly that that's not what he wanted. And we see lots of, there's that verse in, where is it?
The Bible.
It's in the Bible. Yes. It's in the First Testament. I don't delight in sacrifice. But in, what is it?
Amos.
I thought it was one of the other minor. It's a minor prophet, all right. I thought it was one of the other ones. Anyway, just how God doesn't delight. Oh, Sarah Jane's going to find the verse. But it's how God doesn't delight in sacrifice or in burnt offerings, but in a humble and contrite heart, I think. Something along those lines. And so sometimes when I read the story, I wonder, is that what God was?
Psalm 51.
Yeah, there's one of the prophets, minor prophets as well. But yeah. So if that's what God was trying to do, this object lesson, so that the Israelite nation that would come about would never be involved in child sacrifice. And it worked. Apart from this gentleman who thought it would be a good idea to offer the first creature out of his home, we don't really read about child sacrifices because they were so, I think this story did the job. And then I just want to look briefly at sanctification. So we've looked at silence in this story, we've looked at sacrifice, and then we're just going to look at sanctification. So one of the things that we all read about Abraham is his faith. He's included in the heroes of the faith in Hebrews. Paul and Jesus speak about the faith of Abraham. And from a Jewish point of view, his faith needed works. That's what they believed, that it needed works. So they see that this trial of Abraham's was the work by which he proved that he believed in God. There's one particular school of thought is that he actually did kill Isaac, and that God raised him from the dead, and that he was about to kill him again, because he was nothing if not determined. And then that's why the angel says, Abraham, Abraham, because the first time he didn't hear him, and he calls him again, and he says, here I am. I don't know, but I thought it was an interesting school of thought, and he was trying to do it again. So there's a Jewish theologian, and he wrote a whole book about this chapter. But one of the sentences he wrote is that one person's religious fulfillment or sanctification cannot come through harm to another. And I thought it was such a profound sentence, and lends weight to his whole idea that it was God never wanted the sacrifice, because we cannot be sanctified, we cannot receive grace through harm to another. And how often has that happened? How often have others been harmed? Wars been fought over beliefs, over differences in beliefs. And I don't think that's what God wanted at all. I often think it's ironic that the Christian faith which throughout the whole of Scripture we can see a heart of God to enlarge it, to encompass the whole world. From the little slave girl who said, "Oh, would that my master could go and meet the prophet, he would heal him of his leprosy." For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. To Jesus' conversations with the woman at the well, with the Syrophoenician woman, with the thief on the cross. "Today you will be with me in paradise." To the debates in Acts about who is allowed in to the church and who should be kept out. And still today we have this faction and that faction praying this way and that way, and I think we've missed a lot of the point that the Bible, Jesus and God were trying to make. So I don't think God wanted Abraham to kill Isaac ever. I don't know what Abraham thought as he walked for 3 days. I wouldn't like to be in his shoes. It is interesting to note that at the end of this, Abraham goes and lives somewhere. We don't read that Isaac went and lived with him. In the next chapter, Sarah dies and Abraham travels to bury her. And I think if I went home and my children said, "Daddy took us for a walk today and tried to kill us," I wouldn't be living at home either. So, but the cost of even going through with this for Abraham, for Isaac, probably, it's all, there's no, this whole story, this whole journey happens without any insight into what's going on or what comes after. If it was nowadays, like, there'd be trauma, there'd be counselling for Isaac, there'd be, a reconciliation, there'd be all of these things. But no, they just come back down the mountain. He goes off with his 2 young men servants, and that's it. Next chapter, Sarah dies. Next chapter, Abraham's having a rough week, like, certainly. He also got rid of Ishmael in the previous chapter, kicked him and his mother out at Sarah's behest. So, it's just family falling apart left, right, and centre. So, I do feel for Abraham. I thought it was interesting when Dawn says, "Are you Abraham or are you Isaac?" And I don't know. It's an interesting question. But just to conclude, I'm just going to read that sentence again. One person's religious fulfillment or sanctification cannot come through harm to another.